This is another one of those super bummer lectures. And this time what we're going to talk about is a set of famous critiques and other caveats about that beautiful paper by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. So I'm going to outline essentially 4 important critiques or alternative stories. One by Jeffrey Sachs, one by David Alboui, another by Engerman and Sokoloff, and then I'll finish with a 4th possible critique, which is just to remind you about Allen's theory of economic growth during the Industrial Revolution. All right, so let's begin with a famous critique by Jeffrey Sachs. To understand this critique, it's important to remember that it's critical to the story presented by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson that the instrumental variable that they choose satisfies the exclusion restriction. So in particular, that instrument that they choose, settler mortality, cannot have a direct effect on economic outcomes, so GDP per capita, in the present day. What Jeffrey Sachs asks is actually possibly is could settler mortality have this direct effect, and how could it? Sachs points out that the disease environment today is actually a major strong predictor of economic outcomes as they exist today. He stresses, in particular, a story about the prevalence of malaria. And what he says is that, malaria may not kill you, but if you live in a place where mosquitoes transmitting malaria is a big problem, you can spend a lot of your life using a lot of energy constantly fighting malaria. It is debilitating and it is exhausting. And even if you reach the point where you don't feel like actively sick, it can still bring you down a notch in your energy level in particular. So you don't have to be killed by malaria to suffer its effects. In this way, actually, the current day disease environment maybe does have a direct effect on economic outcomes. Okay, we talked about how Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson respond to this critique. I think it's kind of up to you whether you think they've done a convincing job getting around this. Maybe a more damning critique is the comment published by David Alboui on the empirical work that's at the heart of this article. What Alboui did is really deadly, okay? So he tried to replicate Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson based on the materials they posted along with the article. And what he found were a lot of inconsistencies in the empirical work. In particular, here's the really deadly thing he found. So when we do economic history, we've talked about this, sometimes you don't have all the data that you want, and so you have to make some kind of assumption in order to move forward. And what happened in this article is that Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson didn't have exact settler mortality data for every little place that would have been in their data. I mean, countries and their borders have changed a lot over time, so they have to make some kind of assumption of how to assign settler mortality, for example, to places that didn't exist. What's bad, however, is that Alboui found that they tended to make choices of the assignment of settler mortality to these places in ways that helped them find the result that they wanted, that biased the results in favor of what they wanted to show. That's really bad practice. What you should do is try to have these assumptions work against you so that if you still find a result, it looks really convincing. What's maybe even worse than that is what Alboui finds is that if you perturb some of these choices, and you perturb some of the other choices they make, for example, about how to estimate their standard errors, you can just breathe on these results and they go away. So if you're curious about this, you can take a look at that comment. It's also published in the American Economic Review in 2012. And if you take Economics 329 with me next semester, we dig into that comment in a little bit more detail. You can actually see some of this assignment if you take a look at that motivating graph right at the beginning of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. And what you see is that some of the data, right, they're kind of clustered in certain positions on the x-axis on log settler mortality. You see these vertical lines of points that all have the same level of log settler mortality. Those are the points where they sort of assigned some of the same values to places that may not have existed in the past or that they literally didn't have data in the past. So That's probably what gave it away to Albu at the beginning, that there might be something fishy going on that was worth checking. Okay, so those are kind of depressing in the sense that they're direct critiques of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. It's also worth noting that there are some alternative theories out there that are also highly influential that have a kind of similar character to them in the sense of like thinking about a geographic explanation and its effect on the variation institutions that we might see today. So Engerman and Sokolov's argument, in some ways it sounds a lot like Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, but it has some subtle differences. So what Engerman and Sokolov argue is that what's important at the moment of colonization is not necessarily the disease environment, but instead the kind of factor endowment that was encountered at that moment of colonization and how that might lead to inequality on the ground in those places and hence better or worse institutions. Okay, so like think about the following scenario. Like they really are interested in particular in factor endowments like the discovery of places that were good for growing sugar and also places that had rich and exploitable mines or other natural resources. And so here's the idea. If the colonists arrive and they don't actually find very much of value, what will happen is probably those colonists will be more equal. There'll be more equality in that place. And when you have equality, the kinds of institutions that you tend to found reinforce that equality. They tend to promote, for example, democracy and other kinds of openness in order to preserve the equality that they have. Those kinds of institutions, we think, tend to favor growth. If, however, the colonists arrive and there's a really rich natural resource that a few people can just grab and take advantage of, what will arise is inequality. And those elites in that system are going to create institutions that allow them to stay at the top, that protect their elite status. Those kinds of institutions seem to promote less growth. The graph that they present, or the table I should say they present, to motivate this is what they call the great reversals. So if you go way back in time to 1700, what you can notice is that some of the places that were really rich in the early years, like Cuba and Barbados, for example, they're not the richest places today, right? And not by far. Whereas some places that actually started out seeming like they didn't have incredibly rich resources, like Canada, can become very rich today. They can have as much as 76% of the GDP per capita of the United States. So this kind of tells you the story in a single table of this idea of the great reversals. And so what they're puzzling is, you might have expected that if you have like a big factor endowment at the beginning, that you stay rich, but instead it goes the other way. That's, I think, a really compelling story. So finding, like, if you think about like comparing and contrasting these two stories, it's like really interesting to try to tease out what exactly is different, right? So in Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson, what happens is the initial conditions give rise to either extractive institutions or neo-Europes. And Engerman and Sokolov, what the initial institutions do is they create systems that preserve either equality or inequality. But what's common between the two, right, is this geographic story of the birth of early institutions which tend to persist. Furthermore, notice that there's a lot of correlation between the places that had those good initial factor endowments and the disease environment. There's a lot going on here that's all correlated. It's very hard to tease one out from the other. And this all is the reason why achieving perfect identification in this research question is really, really hard. I'll finish now with just a brief reminder of where we were last week. Let's recall Bob Allen's explanation of the causes of the British Industrial Revolution. Remember that we had an institutional story about the British Industrial Revolution that came through North and Weingast, who emphasized the role of institutions. But according to Allen, it's not institutions. It's none of this. What matters is just input prices. And so, like, when I try to reconcile these stories in my mind, I can believe some parts of the story by North and Weingast. Like, I can believe that it may be necessary for there to be strong property rights protections, strong controls on the judiciary, and strong growth of capital markets to create an industrial revolution. But maybe a way to reconcile this is to think that those institutional effects, if they exist, are second order, while the price story is a first order strong effect. This, I think, we could debate endlessly, and something to keep in mind as we start to think about the midterm